my name is Ryan Slobodjan, and I'm here with John Allspaw, the SVP of Technical Operations at Etsy. So, let's start off with a simple question with a complex answer. What's DevOps?
I knew you were going to ask that. Oh, it's a good question. It's a word. It's a good word. I think it's a word that that describes what Patrick Dubois, the coiner of the word, would describe a wicked problem. I would say that the word describes, I think, cultural and professional movement. I think is the way that's generally described. A set of, to some degree, a set of practices, not really prescriptive, a set of behaviors, a set of organizational values, essentially the respectful collaboration of two domain expertises coming together and augmenting their abilities, I would say. How's that?
Okay, sounds good. What is DevOps not?
It's not a product. I don't believe it's a team. I don't believe it's a role. I don't believe it's a strategy. I don't believe it is a recipe. I don't believe it is a methodology. I think that the difficulty with defining it or not defining it points to how engineering as a whole, as computer science as a whole, has a relationship with abstraction in general. There's a double-edged sword with abstraction, and I would say that DevOps is a construct, is an abstraction. It's a funny thing. So at Etsy, we were talking the other day. You never hear the word DevOps at Etsy at work in regular conversation. It just feels weird to say, that's because of the DevOps. No, we would never say that. It feels really silly. And the way I like to think of it is if you sort of search and replace in your inner monologue where you would say DevOps and replace it with collaboration, coordination, cooperation, communication. If you were to replace where you would say DevOps with those things, then it would sound silly. We've got the cooperation group. They're on the case. Cooperation group's going to totally kill it out. They're gonna solve that problem.
They're going to collaborate the snot out of that problem.
Yeah, that's they are so keen on collaborating. That's yeah. I mean, of course, that's their name, so therefore that's the thing that they do is they collaborate. Nobody else really collaborates, of course, because otherwise their name would be collaboration. So yeah, that's sort of my view on it. I think that any amount of unease that we have with definitions needs to be okay. And I think that most engineering projects, no matter what domain it is, deals with uncertainty. It deals in vagueness. The interesting engineering problems, the interesting engineering solutions, all come from a place where there are gray areas. And if we expect solidity, if we expect certainty, if we expect sort of a hard science definition on essentially what is a social science construct, then we're a bit doomed. Or it at the very least says a lot about the person wanting to use it in a very sort of strict, prescriptive way.
So a few years ago, as part of a discussion I had, I tried to reduce Agile down to one word description. The word I came up with was communication. it seems that all of the Agile processes and practices are about increasing communication of some kind. So builds communicate failures. Developers communicate with product owners. It all boils down to communication and increasing bandwidth and frequency of communication.
Mm.
Do you think that the DevOps perspective on that increase of collaboration communication, is that kind of part of the same thing that led to Agile on the developer and business side?
There's a lot in there. That's a good question, and it's a question that's been asked before. And in matter of fact, I think I remember, before Dubois came up with the word DevOps, he and Andrew Schaefer, I think, were at an open spaces. They were the only attendees at an open space discussion called Agile Web Operations. Let's set that aside for a second. I don't know if I agree with the premise. I would say that, but maybe I'm mostly asking for a clarification. I would argue that it's not about more communication. Now, in a world where there's a dearth of communication, more communication, or the volume of communication can be is arguably a good thing. I would say different and constructive communication for those scenarios. You can have a large volume of communication between a very toxic relationship between development and operations. So more communication, I would even say, is not exactly equal to better. So I'm realizing as I get older, I'm becoming more of a language nitpicker. So I apologize for this. I would say that yes, that engaging in sort of joint activity, which is really what both of those domains, I think, ought to be doing. At least if they ever hope to provide the company with progress, or enabling the company or your business to have value, then they want to sort of act as joint groups. Now, the people over process, that sort of thing, that's a good question. To what extent is Agile, or to what extent are the tenets of the Agile Manifesto feel like common sense? And like Schaefer says, common sense isn't common. So I would say that they just have the hallmarks of a good idea. A good idea is extremely simple, and it's also fascinating that you hadn't thought of it before. And so I would say that, where does this come from? I would say that the most successful companies, places where you would say a culture of this sort of culture of collaboration and deferring in domain expertise and augmenting different skill sets is, bears fruit. Google's, Amazon's, Facebook's, Etsy's, Flickr's. I would say that in those scenarios, it just simply became a competitive advantage. It was easier to gain leverage in the. It was easier to gain leverage, basically. I wouldn't say that it's that the source of DevOps is simply something that came from a capitalistic urge. I don't think it's an artifact of sort of the commercial pressures. However, I think what resonates with most people when they see talks on this, or when they hear stories about the benefits of these two groups bringing both of their domain expertise together in a scenario where they're both deferring and augmenting, then that strikes a chord, right? Because it's a different relationship. It's, I had a, abusive relationship, and then we broke up, and now I've got a new relationship, and it's awesome. This transition who doesn't want that transition? And so I'd say that there's probably, my guess is that there's something emotional about that transition that sticks out for people, right? We have the grumpy sort of BOFH in the corner with the stereotypical, the caricature, right? The big guy with the beard who says no all the time, right? And then there's the sort of the archetype of the sort of prima donna developer who, you know, thinks they're smarter than everybody. And nobody ever views themselves as those archetypes, but they view the other people as those archetypes. So if there's an outlet to say, actually, it turns out that there's a different comic strip. Like those cartoons, actually, you can put down that comic book and pick up a different one where, you know, these people working together are much stronger than either of them are individually. That's a bit of that feels hopeful. So that's probably why it became strong. But again, I think it would be amiss if we didn't think about about how getting good at this sort of stuff is absolutely a competitive advantage in the market.
So one of the teams I've worked on in the past, when rebuilding the website from scratch, the company's main reason for being, one of the major changes was that we included operations in the development process, and the director of operations was in on a lot of our discussions, our weekly status update, feature planning, etc. And what I found really interesting about that was, because of the very different world of experience, somebody with an operations background could come up with completely different solutions that you would expect. And they also tend to have the whole view. So for instance, I mean, as a software developer, and I found myself falling into this trap, you think of things in terms of code, in terms of algorithms, in terms of how the system works inside of a single VM. You don't think of things like, how much network I/O am I burning? You don't think of, well, if I'm communicating with all n other nodes, then when I get past about 60, have I just completely rendered my network inaccessible because of the amount of chatter? It seems that because of that, the two different perspectives and bodies of experience, you end up having a far stronger team as a result. And then if you do something like create a DevOps team, which is a third team, you stick it in the middle, you've actually made the silo problem worse rather than better.
Agreed. You know, you touched on something there about having, you know, in the scenario where you have, you know, I have my hammer is code. This is going to reflect both my skills and also my experience, right? When faced with a design decision like, oh, we need these two nodes to talk to each other. One node has a persistent store of some kind. Let's say it's a database, or let's say it's something else, and the other one doesn't. And one has to ask questions, right? So you have design decisions. Oh, should I use, well, what's the protocol? I could use HTTP, I could use UDP, I could use TCP, I could use some other thing. Maybe I should invent my own, you know, binary protocol, and I'll do this and I'll do that and whatever. The lessons you learn as you develop those sorts of things, and I do think that there's something very, very inherent about distributed applications, or essentially any application that requires more than one machine, right? And we had it up on the slide, Eric had it up on the slide earlier, the fallacies of distributed computing. I would argue that that could be a gateway drug for developers to think operationally. If you were to, you know, when I first saw those fallacies of distributed computing as an operations person, so I was like, yeah, of course, you know. And for a developer whose scope and can be forgiven for this, you know, his scope is I need functionality is my goal, right? And along the edges of my goal, hopefully maybe I'll have sprinkle a little bit of fault tolerance, a little bit of reliability, maybe, some transactional nature. I don't want to lose data, so therefore I'll put some safety sort of mechanism, guardrails around it. But however, it's still going to do this thing, right? Pictures of cats, movie files, audio processing, whatever it is. They can be forgiven about making their assumptions when they make design decisions. Operations does this as well, but it's only when you have that conversation that you realize, oh, the world is a nail, and this is the hammer that feels not only is the thing that I have, code or network or resource consumption, metrics collection, right? My world isn't actually nails. It's only the world that I can see because I have a hammer in my hand. And oh hey, there are bricks there out in the world. That's kind of crazy. I'm going to bring so as a developer, I'm going to bring my skills, also my expertise. What's bitten me in the past, I may have a bias because I may want my future decisions not to bite me like that. And so does an ops person, right? One of the examples of where this conversation can take place is when designing, especially when you involve operations folks early on. Let's say we had that scenario before where we have more than one machine talking, and it needs to talk to other machines, right? This is a thing that happens. So how do we distribute this? Like, let's say we need, we would like redundancy. We don't want to lose it all if one box goes down. So how do we distribute conversations amongst a group of nodes? Well, it depends. Are these nodes different? Okay, let's say that they're sort of different, but not really different. Let's say that it's really groups of clusters. All right, well, how can we do this? So in my application code, I can write an array with host names, and I can shuffle through them with some sort of algorithm, right? Round robin, that sort of thing. I can completely outsource this decision making to a network device like a load balancer. I can completely outsource it to a decision maker. Let's say a DNS. All of a sudden now we have round robin or some other sort of weighted DNS response. So I've relegated decisions to either a different device, a different protocol, maybe a different application, or I'll take responsibility for the application. Each one of them are fine choices, absolutely fine choices, each with pros and cons and advantages and disadvantages, which may or may not work in every scenario. Welcome to that uncertainty that I talked about earlier. Having a mature conversation about those constraints, right? As a developer, I want to have it in code because I can do a lot more clever things with it if cleverness is required. If cleverness is not required, I'd rather not deal with it. So just give me a magical virtual IP that will just pretend like it's these group of nodes, and it'll just do whatever. Sure, load balancer, mumble, I've got to do this stuff over here. So in navigating that decision, in navigating both the choices, the pros and cons of each, and how long we expect to have that conversation, sits on a spectrum between efficiency and thoroughness. I can decide it's the array. You can decide it's the load balancer. If we say, well, we don't know what it is yet, but we're committed to having a conversation about it, and let's say we don't want the conversation to be more than an hour. Okay. We don't want the conversation to be more than 6 months. Okay. We don't want the conversation to be more than a year. These bring various, concerns to the table that will almost certainly be invisible unless we have a conversation. At least acknowledge where and how those sorts of decisions are being made. So I don't know if I kind of talked at you for a little bit. I don't know if this answered a question, but.
Oh, definitely. Thank you.